Brier Ridge, Wyoming Territory, late spring, 1878. The sun hung high in the sky, its relentless heat bearing down on the dusty town square, casting an oppressive weight over the crowd. The dry earth cracked beneath the feet of the onlookers, who had gathered in a circle around three women bound to wooden posts. Their hands were tightly lashed behind them, their faces stained with sweat and dirt, their eyes reflecting a quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. The women stood in stark contrast to the cruel spectacle unfolding before them. The town had already passed its judgment, and now they had come for the punishment. No trial, no defense, just accusations, whispers thrown around like stones. They had been labeled as women of ill repute, sinners who had broken the town's sacred moral order. The townsfolk, eager for a show, stood in judgment, eyes wide with anticipation. There was no sympathy here, only the hunger for spectacle. The sheriff, a tall man with a smug grin, stood confidently atop his horse, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he were the puppet master pulling all the strings. And then, something unexpected happened. Two little girls, no older than 5, stepped forward from behind a nearby cart. Their golden hair shimmered in the sunlight, their faces innocent and untouched by the cruelty of the world. They held hands, their small fingers trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. Their voices, though tiny, rang out with surprising clarity amidst the mockery of the crowd. "Papa, that's her." The crowd fell silent. The sharpness of the words cut through the jeers like a knife. It was as if time itself had frozen. All eyes turned to Caleb Whitmore, who stood at the back of the crowd. His presence was quiet, understated, but it was impossible to ignore. Caleb had recently arrived in Brier Ridge, known only for his work as a horse breeder and the two little girls who never left his side. They called him Papa, but beyond that, no one knew where he came from or what had brought him to this town. His gaze, though, was fixed not on the crowd, but on the woman the little girls had pointed to, Delilah Quinn. For a moment, there was no sound. Caleb did not speak. He simply stood there, his weathered face unreadable, as he observed the situation unfolding before him. Delilah stood tall, despite the ropes that bound her wrists, her bruised face a silent testament to the town's cruelty. There was no pleading in her eyes, no begging for mercy, only defiance, only strength. Caleb's silence spoke volumes, his posture rigid and unwavering. His daughters, June and May, clung to his legs, their eyes wide with the innocence only children could possess. But they had made their choice. They had pointed to Delilah, and now Caleb was forced to make a decision. The arrival of Caleb Whitmore. Caleb Whitmore's name had been whispered in Brier Ridge only in passing, mostly in reference to the horses he bred and the two little girls who were almost always by his side. He was a man of few words, a man who kept to himself and preferred to stay out of the limelight. But today, as he stood at the edge of the crowd, something had shifted. The sheriff, with his cruel grin and sharp words, had expected Caleb to play along with the mockery, to choose one of the women and take her home. It was a twisted game of control, and Sheriff Doyle had always enjoyed his position of power. But Caleb wasn't playing. He wasn't here for the sheriff's cruel joke or to make a spectacle of the women. He was here for something else entirely. The little girls, June and May, had tugged at his legs, pointed to Delilah. And in that moment, Caleb knew that the choices he made today would change the course of everything. Caleb didn't respond immediately to the sheriff. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to send a message. Instead, he locked eyes with Delilah, who stood against the posts, her face bruised, but her gaze unwavering. For the first time in the entire town square, Caleb's eyes softened. He could see something in her, something that had been lost in the whispers and gossip of the town. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame, it was strength. The sheriff, sensing a moment of weakness, taunted Caleb, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's it going to be, Whitmore? Choose a woman. Take one home for the girls." But Caleb didn't answer. Instead, his boots crunched against the dusty earth as he slowly walked forward, his gaze fixed on Delilah. It was a quiet march, not one of urgency, but of resolve. And with every step he took, the tension in the air grew thicker. The sheriff's officer, Sheriff Doyle, sensing that the moment had passed, turned his attention to Caleb. He couldn't understand it. Caleb Whitmore, a man who had kept to himself for so long, wasn't playing by the sheriff's rules, and that irritated him. "Well, now, Whitmore," the sheriff sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I see you're a man of few words, but we both know you've got those two little girls at home. They need a woman, don't they? You've got a chance here to make things right. You can choose one of these women. Call it mercy, call it marriage, but it's your call." The crowd laughed, a few of them exchanging glances, whispering among themselves. It was all a game to them, an opportunity to watch a man bend to the will of the law, to see who would break first. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the sheriff's words. His eyes never left Delilah. It wasn't about what the sheriff wanted. It wasn't about what the crowd expected. It was about what Caleb saw in Delilah's eyes. He saw a woman who had been broken by the world, yet still stood tall. He saw strength, not guilt. And that was the moment Caleb made his choice. The moment of choice. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply walked forward, his boots crunching in the silence that had fallen over the square. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing through the tense air. June and May, still clutching his legs, tugged at him again, their voices soft but certain. "That's her, Papa." Their tiny hands pointed toward Delilah once more, and Caleb followed their direction. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what was happening. The sheriff, once so confident in his power, sat frozen on his horse. There were no cheers, no jeers, just the quiet hum of anticipation in the air. Caleb reached Delilah, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply watched him, waiting. Her hands were still bound, but there was a strength in her gaze that spoke louder than any words could. Without a word, Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. The crowd gasped, unsure of what would happen next. With one swift motion, Caleb cut through the ropes binding Delilah's wrists. The sound of the hemp snapping was loud, almost deafening in the quiet. Delilah gasped as her hands fell free, the rawness of her skin still visible from the tight ropes. But she didn't move. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there, breathing deeply, her eyes never leaving Caleb's. The sheriff's smirk faded. He sat motionless on his horse, unsure of what to do next. Caleb, however, didn't wait for approval or permission. He took off his coat and draped it over Delilah's shoulders, offering her a silent gesture of protection. And then, without a word, Caleb turned and began to walk away, his daughters at his side. Delilah followed him, her movements slow but resolute. The crowd watched as they left, the weight of their judgment hanging in the air, but no one dared to speak. A silent walk away. As Caleb, Delilah, and the twins walked away from the square, the weight of the moment pressed on the shoulders of every onlooker. No one moved, no one spoke. The sound of their footsteps in the dusty street was the only sound that cut through the heavy silence. The people of Brier Ridge had come for a spectacle. They had gathered to watch the sheriff's cruelty play out, to see the women tied to the posts and mocked. But now, as the women were freed, their hopes of a brutal display were shattered. The townspeople stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do with what had just unfolded. Caleb didn't look back. His eyes were fixed ahead, focused on the small group he had created with Delilah and his daughters. His hand rested gently on the twins, guiding them forward. June and May walked quietly beside him, their small hands clutching his legs. Delilah followed close behind, her body stiff with the weight of everything that had happened, but her steps unyielding. The crowd stared after them. Some eyes were wide with disbelief. Others were filled with shame, as if the weight of their previous judgment had become too heavy to bear. Delilah's gaze remained forward. Her shoulders set in, quiet determination. She had no time for the judgment of the crowd. She had already been condemned by them. Now, she was free. Caleb's movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if every step he took led him away from the past he was leaving behind. He wasn't walking towards something. He was walking away from everything he had ever known, away from the town that had held him in silent contempt, away from the life he'd tried to escape. He was moving towards something he could only begin to understand, something new that he could shape with his own hands. As they passed through the square, the crowd's silence continued. No one shouted. No one stopped them. They simply watched as Caleb, Delilah, and the twins made their way to the edge of town. There was no triumph in Caleb's stride, no grand speech or act of heroism. He simply walked, his daughters at his side and Delilah beside him. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt a sense of peace, a quiet strength that came from doing the right thing, from standing up to the law that had once kept him chained. The air was heavy with judgment, but it was no longer Caleb who carried that weight. It was the people of Brier Ridge who were left with the burden of their own actions, the cost of their cruelty. Caleb, however, did not look back. He knew that the real battle was behind him now, and the real fight was yet to come. A quiet ride to redemption. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Caleb led Delilah and the twins out of Brier Ridge. They rode together, slowly, their horses' hooves carrying them along the dusty path that led to Caleb's ranch. The day was drawing to a close, but for Delilah, the quiet ride felt like a new beginning. She had never known a life like this before. She had never known peace. The long ride, though silent, felt full of possibility, like something had shifted inside her that she could not yet name. Caleb sat tall in the saddle, his daughters riding in front of him, each one nestled against his chest. They giggled as they looked out over the landscape, pointing out things they saw along the way. The wind in the trees, the distant mountains, the small animals skittering across the road. Their carefree joy felt like an anchor, pulling Delilah back to a time before everything had fallen apart. Delilah, on the other hand, rode beside Caleb, her mind racing. Her wrists still throbbed with the memory of the ropes, but her heart was lighter. It was as if the weight of the past had lifted just a little. She felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. She had always been running from the accusations, from the shame, but now she was walking towards something she could claim for herself. The landscape around them stretched on endlessly, the sun casting long shadows over the land. The quiet of the open plains was a stark contrast to the noise and judgment of Brier Ridge. Here, the only sound was the rhythm of their horses' steps, the soft wind that brushed against their faces, and the occasional laughter of June and May. Delilah looked around her, taking in the wide open spaces. She had always been a prisoner of her circumstances, of the judgment of others. But here, in this place, she was free. She was beginning to understand that she could start over, that there was more to her life than the rumors and the accusations that had followed her for so long. By the time they reached Caleb's ranch, the sun had nearly set. The horizon was painted in soft oranges and purples, a gentle reminder that the day was ending, but a new one was about to begin. Caleb dismounted first, his movements smooth and practiced. He reached up to lift June and May down, their small feet hitting the ground with light thuds. Then he turned to Delilah, offering her his hand. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. It had been so long since anyone had treated her like this, like she mattered, like she had a place. Her hand trembled slightly, and as she reached for his, and as she stepped down from the horse, she was overwhelmed by a strange feeling, a mixture of fear and hope. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The simple gesture was enough. He was offering her not just his hand, but something more. A place in this world. A place where she didn't have to apologize for her past. A place where she could be free. As they walked toward the small house on the ranch, Delilah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The land around her felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could leave the judgment behind and start anew. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to forgive herself. A silent understanding. The days on Caleb Whitmore's ranch passed in a quiet rhythm. Delilah had never known such peace. The simple chores, the steady routine, the laughter of June and May, all wove a comfort she hadn't thought possible. She had been running for so long, always hiding from the past. But now, here in this small house surrounded by open land, she could finally take a breath. The modest room Caleb had shown her to that first night felt like a sanctuary. A single bed with worn but clean sheets, a small window that framed the distant mountains, and the soft, steady hum of the world outside. She spent her first night there staring out the window, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. Caleb didn't ask her questions. He didn't press her for her story. He didn't need to. His silence was a language of its own. And with that silence, he had given her something she hadn't had in a long time: space to heal. One evening, as the sun began to set and the golden light spilled across the land, Caleb placed a plate of food outside her door. The small gesture spoke volumes. It wasn't a command. It wasn't charity. It was simply a quiet acknowledgement of her presence, a way of welcoming her into this life without expecting anything in return. The food was simple: cornbread, beans, and a slice of dried apple. But it was the first meal that had ever felt like it was hers. Delilah stood at the door for a long time, staring at the plate, unsure of what to do. She hadn't been able to bring herself to eat it at first. It felt strange, this gesture of care. She had lived for so long in survival mode, always moving, always fighting, never able to stop and just be. But the more she looked at the meal, the more she realized that Caleb wasn't asking her to explain herself. He wasn't asking for anything at all. So, she did what she had not done in years. She ate. She sat down by the window, looking out over the land as she ate slowly, savoring every bite. Each one felt like a small act of reclaiming her life, a life she thought she had lost forever. The following morning, Delilah woke to the sound of children's laughter, light and carefree. June and May were playing in the yard, their feet bare and their dresses covered in dirt. They were so young, so innocent, and yet their presence was already changing her world. The weight of her past, once so suffocating, seemed a little lighter every time she looked at them. She stepped outside, drawn to their laughter, and as she did, she noticed something. May had a slight limp. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Delilah's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she knelt down to inspect the boot that was causing the limp. It was worn thin, the sole nearly gone, and Delilah felt a pang in her chest. She could feel the connection to these girls deep in her bones, the need to protect them, to care for them, to be something for them that no one had ever been for her. Without saying a word, Delilah took the boot inside, sat down by the fire, and began to mend it. Her fingers trembled as she worked, but each stitch was precise, steady. She hadn't done something like this in a long time, hadn't cared for something so small in years. But as she worked, she realized how much it meant. It wasn't just about the boots. It was about the quiet connection she was building with these children, and through them, a connection to herself. Caleb watched her from the doorway, his arms folded. He didn't speak, but there was something in his gaze that said everything. He had trusted her with his girls, and for the first time in years, Delilah felt like she was worthy of that trust. The memory of snow. The days slipped by quietly, and Delilah began to find a rhythm. She had never known such peace before, and while it felt strange, it also felt like home. But despite the simplicity and beauty of the ranch, there was still a lingering shadow in Delilah's heart. The memory of that terrible winter, the cold, the isolation, and the fear clung to her like a second skin. One day, as the twins played outside, Delilah caught herself lost in a memory. It was from the time before Brier Ridge, before the accusations, before the sheriff and the town had branded her a killer. It was from the snowstorm. She had been alone, huddled with two small girls under a tree in the bitter cold. She had tried to keep them warm, had tried to protect them as best she could, but the cold had seeped through her, through everything. She could still remember the feel of the snowflakes falling around them, the soft whispers of the wind, and the sound of her own voice singing to keep the girls awake, keep them alive. "I remember them," Delilah whispered to herself, her hands trembling slightly as she worked the needle through the worn leather. The memory of that night was vivid, the pain of it sharp, but it also reminded her of the strength she had found in that snowstorm. She had been there for them. She had kept them alive, just as she had promised. As she finished mending the boot, Delilah took a deep breath, allowing herself to process the memory. She hadn't spoken of it in years. She hadn't let herself remember the women she had saved, the girls who had clung to her in the cold, the ones she had lost track of when the storm took her under. But now, with June and May laughing outside, she allowed herself to feel the weight of that memory. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a failure. She didn't feel like the woman the town had tried to break. Later that evening, as Delilah finished the last of the mending, Caleb came inside. His eyes flickered toward the boots, then back to her. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet understanding. Caleb didn't need to ask about the boots. He didn't need to know why she had chosen this moment to work. He simply nodded and walked toward the fire, his face thoughtful. Delilah didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. Caleb had given her space, had given her the chance to start over, and in that moment, she realized how much he had trusted her, not just with his home, but with his girls. The return of Delilah Quinn. The peaceful rhythm of the ranch was disrupted one morning by a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the town. Delilah had noticed the change in the air, a quiet whispering that had grown louder over the past few days. People began to speak in hushed tones, gathering in small groups, their eyes flickering nervously toward the edge of town. Delilah didn't know what was happening, but she could sense it. Then, one day, Elias Quinn returned. Elias was Delilah's brother, a man she had lost track of years ago when everything had gone wrong. He had disappeared after the murder of her husband, Thomas. No one knew where he had gone, and for years, Delilah had lived in the shadow of that unanswered question. But now, Elias had come back. The people of Brier Ridge were shocked. They had written him off as a ghost, a man lost to the world. But now he was here, standing before them with a look of determination on his face. Delilah's breath caught in her throat as she saw him standing in the town square, the same fire in his eyes that she remembered from their youth. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the courthouse steps, pulling a small satchel from his side. The crowd hushed, the whispers dying down as they waited to see what Elias would do. Elias placed the satchel on the ground and opened it, revealing an old wax cylinder and a small envelope. The townspeople leaned in, unsure of what to expect. "This," Elias said, his voice low but clear, "is the truth about what happened to my sister's husband, the truth about who really killed him." The tension in the air was electric as Elias placed the wax cylinder on the phonograph and began to play it. The sound crackled, faint at first, but then the unmistakable voice of Thomas Quinn, Delilah's late husband, filled the square. "Redemption and home. The voice of Thomas Quinn, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the square, each word like a stone, thrown into the still waters of Brier Ridge's lies. You think you're better than me, Thomas? Think just 'cause you wear a badge, you can control everything? You think you can take what's mine? The crowd fell silent as the recording played. The struggle between Thomas and Sheriff Doyle captured forever on that wax cylinder. The fight, the gunshot, the unmistakable sound of a life taken. The recording didn't lie. The truth was here. And with it, everything that had been hidden in the shadows for so long was now exposed. Sheriff Doyle stood frozen, his face pale, his grip tightening on the reins of his horse. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. His reign of terror was over. The crowd, which had once stood behind him, now began to look away. Some were ashamed, others simply stunned by the truth they had long denied. Caleb's voice, steady and calm, cut through the tension. You want to punish her, but you never bothered to look at the truth. She's not the guilty one. It's time to let her go. The sheriff didn't respond. His face was drawn, his mouth tight, but the power had left him. Caleb turned to Delilah, his eyes meeting hers. The past was over. The truth had been spoken, and now they could move forward. As Delilah's heart swelled with the truth, the weight of years of judgment, of silence, fell away. She wasn't just free. She was finally able to breathe again. And when the sun set that night, Caleb's name, side by side with Delilah's, was carved into the barn door. The land they had fought for, the life they had built, was theirs. Together,